Humperdinck screamed toward her then, ripping at her autumn hair, yanking her from her feet and down the long curving corridor to her room, where he tore that door open and threw her inside and locked her there and started running for the underground entrance to the Zoo of Death. And down he plunged, giant stride after giant stride, and when he threw the doors of the fifth-level cage open, even Count Rugen was startled at the purity of whatever the emotion was that was reflected in the prince's eyes. The prince moved to Westley. "She loves you," the prince cried. "She loves you still, and you love her. So think of that. Think of this, too. In all the world, you might have been happy, genuinely happy. Not one couple in a century has that chance, not really, no matter what the storybooks say. But you could have had it. And so I would think no one will ever suffer a loss as great as you." And with that, he grabbed the dial and pushed it all the way forward, and the count cried, "Not to 20! But by then it was too late. The death scream had started. It was much worse than the scream of the wild dog. In the first place, the dial for the wild dog had only been set at 6, whereas this was more than triple that. And so naturally enough, it was more than 3 times as long, and more than 3 times as loud. But none of this was really why it was worse. It was the scream from a human throat that made the difference. In her chamber, Buttercup heard it, and it frightened her, but she had not the least idea what it was. By the main door of the castle, Yellen heard it, and it also frightened him, though he couldn't imagine what it was either. All the 100 brutes and fighters flanked by the main door heard it too, and, to a man, they were bothered by it, and they talked it over for quite a while, but none of them had any sound notions as to what it might have been. The great square was filled with common people, excited about the coming wedding and anniversary, and they all heard it too, and no one even made the pretense of not being scared. But again, none of them knew at all what it might have been. The death scream rose higher into the night. All the streets leading into the square were also filled with citizens, all trying to crowd into the square, and they heard it. But once they admitted they were petrified, they gave up trying to guess what it might have been. Inigo knew immediately. In the tiny alley that he and Fezzik were trying to force their way through, he stopped, remembering. The alley led to the streets that led to the square, and the alley was jammed too. "I don't like that sound," Fezzik said, his skin for the moment cold. Inigo grabbed the giant, and the words began pouring out. "Fezzik! Fezzik! That is the sound of ultimate suffering! I know that sound! That was the sound that my heart made when Count Rugen slaughtered my father, and I saw him fall. The man in black makes it now." "You think that's him?" "Who else has cause for ultimate suffering this celebration night?" And with that, he started to follow the sound. But the crowds were in his way, and he was strong, but he was thin, and he cried, "Fezzik! Fezzik, we must track that sound. We must trace it to its source, and I cannot move, so you must lead me. Fly, Fezzik! This is Inigo begging you. Make a path, please!" Well, Fezzik had rarely had anyone beg him for anything, least of all Inigo, and when something like that happened, you did what you could. So Fezzik, without waiting, began to push forward. Lots of people. Fezzik pushed harder. Lots of people began to move. Out of Fezzik's way. Fast. The death scream was starting to fade now, fading in the clouds. "Fezzik!" said Inigo. "All your power now!" Down the alley Fezzik ran, people screaming and diving to get out of his way, and in his footsteps Inigo kept pace, and at the end of the alley was a street, and the scream was fainter now, but Fezzik turned left, and into the middle of the street he went, and he owned it too. No one was in his way. Nothing dared block his way, and the scream was getting just so hard to hear. So with all his might, Fezzik roared, "Quiet!" And the street was suddenly hushed, and Fezzik pounded along, Inigo right behind him. And the scream was still there, still faintly there, and into the great square itself and the castle beyond before the scream was gone. Wesley lay dead by the machine. The prince kept the dial by the 20 mark long after it was necessary, until the count said, "Done." The prince left without another look at Wesley. He took the secret underground stairs 4 at a time. "She actually called me a coward," he said, and then he was gone from sight. Count Rugen started taking notes. Then he threw his quill pen down. He tested Wesley briefly, and then he shook his head. Death was not of any intellectual interest to him at all. When you were dead, you couldn't react to pain. The Count said, "Dispose of the body," because even though he couldn't see the albino, he knew the albino was there. It was really a shame, he realized, as he mounted the stairs after the prince. You just didn't come across victims like Westley every day of the year. When they were gone, the albino came out, pulled the cups from the corpse, decided to burn the body on the garbage pyre behind the castle, which meant a wheelbarrow. He hurried up the underground stairs, came out the secret entrance, moved quickly to the main tool shed. All the wheelbarrows were buried back at the rear wall, behind the hoes and rakes and hedge trimmers. The albino made a hissing sound of displeasure and began to pick his way past all the other equipment. This kind of thing always seemed to happen to him when he was in a hurry. The albino hissed again. Extra work all the time. Wouldn't you just know it? He finally got the barrow out and was just passing the false and deadly supposed main entrance to the zoo when "I'm having the devil's own trouble tracking that scream" was spoken, and the albino whirled to find there, in the castle grounds, a blade-thin stranger with a sword in his hand. The sword suddenly flicked its way to the albino's throat. "Where is the man in black?" the swordsman said then. He had a giant scar slanting down each cheek and seemed like no one to trifle with. Whispered, "I know no man in black." "Did the scream come from that place?" The fellow indicated the main entrance. "Nod." "And the throat it came from. I need this man, so be quick." Whispered, "Wesley," Inigo reasoned. "Sailor, brought here by Rugen?" Nod. "And I reach him where?" The albino hesitated and then pointed to the deadly entrance. Whispered, "He's on the bottom level, 5 levels down." "Then I have no more need of you. Quiet him a while, Fezzik." From behind him, the albino was aware of a giant shadow moving. Funny, he thought, the last thing he remembered. I thought that was a tree. Inigo was on fire now. There was no stopping him. Fezzik hesitated by the main door. Why would he tell the truth? "He's a zookeeper threatened with death. Why would he lie?" "That doesn't follow." "I don't care," Inigo said sharply, and in fact, he didn't. He knew in his heart that the man in black was down there. There was no other reason for Fezzik to find him, for Fezzik to know of Rugen, for everything to be coming together after so many years of waiting. If there was a God, then there was a man in black waiting. Inigo knew that. He knew it. And of course, he was absolutely right. But again, of course, there were many things he did not know. That the man in black was dead, for one. That the entrance they were taking was the wrong one, for another. A false one, set up to foil those like himself who did not belong. There were spitting cobras down there, though what would actually come at him would be worse. These things he did not know either. But his father had to be revenged, and the man in black would figure out how. That was enough for Inigo. And so with an urgency that would soon turn to deep regret, he and Fezzik approached the Zoo of Death. Now, on a side note, just to be snarky, one of my middle schoolers said, "I'm glad Wesley's dead. He's stupid and annoying." And I could have just left it and ignored it and moved on with class. But I said, okay, let's talk about that. From a storytelling perspective, what would happen if Wesley really did die? What would happen to Buttercup? Where would the story go? Does it serve the story better for Wesley, granted a beloved character from literature? Would it serve the story better for the so-called hero to die and leave the so-called damsel in distress to stand on her own 2 feet and figure out how to get out of the jam that she's in all by herself? It's a story we haven't seen nearly enough, and it's an interesting perspective, and I'm just wondering about your take on that. If you have any comments, let me know below, and let me know what would happen. What do you think would happen if Wesley died? Where would the story go from there? I think it's an interesting question, actually.